Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to the CHP Australia webinar. We're joined today by APCO, the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation. Our members have identified that it's one of our key challenges for our industry is to be more sustainable. Obviously packaging is an issue with mandatories, probably packaging's a little bit bigger than they need to be. So we're really happy to be joined by Brooke Donnelly, the CEO of APCO, and Jane Paramore, the Sustainable Manager for APCO. I won't go through their bios, they're quite long. Hopefully you will have read it with the information that we sent out. So we'll kick off with Brooke. Welcome, Brooke.
Thank you, David, and thank you to David and Rosie and Annalise and the team at CHP for inviting myself and Jane along this morning. I'm very excited to have a bit of a chat. I know Jane especially is excited to talk to you all. She's been doing some work recently in the healthcare sector and working with some of the sectorial activities that are starting to progress in that area. So she's going to fill you in a little bit later on about all of those. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit this morning about, for those of you, I've seen the list of attendees, and I know there are some APCO members there, and there are some people who would be familiar with the work of the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, and perhaps some who are not. And I think the most important thing to remember this morning about APCO and what Jane and I talked to you about is that we're actually here to help you do this job. We're not an industry association, we're actually a co-regulatory body under the National Environment Protection Measure, and our job is to help government and industry to deliver on the work of sustainable packaging in Australia, which means we're here to help you. So we're going to tell you a little bit about how we do that this morning, and then Jane's going to talk to you more specifically about your sector and some of the work that we're doing in healthcare and in areas that may be of interest to you. So if we can move along to the second slide, you can see that for us, one of the questions Dave and the team asked us to address was how are we tracking towards the 2025 national packaging targets, which of course comes with the assumption that you know what they are. You know, for those of you who are not familiar with it, there are a series of targets that are now embedded in the National Waste Policy Action Plan. There is one overarching target, which is that 100% of all packaging in Australia will be recyclable, reusable or compostable by 2025. And then there's a series of targets that are related to that around recycled content, plastic packaging, etc. And this morning we're going to talk to you about how we're tracking against them, where they're at. So if we go to the next slide, we're talking a little bit about, you know, what are the what's happening in the healthcare sector. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the way that APCO works, we're going to talk to you a little bit about the collective impact model, which is the model for how you deliver on a wicked environmental problem like packaging. It's not just about healthcare. We currently in the Australian Packaging Covenant, we have over 1,600 members, and they go across 153 different individual industry sectors. So packaging touches everything. Nobody carries something home in a hand. So packaging is in healthcare, it's in food, it's in, you know, manufacturing of all types. And so, you know, the work becomes very much about how do you help organisations, but as we move further and evolve more towards the circular economy and that transition becomes more paramount as we get closer to 2025, it's also how do we work with the sector and how do we help an industry group and an industry sector actually progress as a collective grouping rather than just as individual organisations. And that's where the collective impact model comes into that. Also talk a little bit about the healthcare industry progress and where some things are, and also where sustainable packaging is in the healthcare sector. Like all sectors, there's some really innovative leading organisations and people doing some interesting work. And we're very familiar with the challenges and the barriers in the space with healthcare. They're very, in many ways, similar to also the food care sector, where you know, you have issues around regulatory requirements, you know, contact with the product itself, you know, and all those kind of issues that are related to those particular sectors. Though not things that we can't overcome, just things that we would be helpful to have a collective approach towards. So we'll talk more about those this morning as well. If we move to the next slide, we can talk to you a little bit about how we're tracking on the 2025 targets. And if we go to the following slide, you'll see that this actually shows you what those targets are. So I mentioned previously the 100% target. You can see that we also have a 70% of plastic packaging, which is either recycled or composted, and a phase out of problematic and unnecessary single-use plastic packaging, and also the 30%. I'm sorry, that's actually incorrect. It should be 50% average recycled content across all packaging. But I think the one that is a concern quite often, especially in healthcare and in food, is around the phase out of problematic and unnecessary single-use plastic packaging. And I imagine a few of you will have some questions this morning about that. And, you know, Jane and I will be happy to talk to those. I mean, I think the important thing here is it's not just about single-use plastic packaging. It's about recognising that they are formats that may be problematic and unnecessary. So are there alternatives? Are there other things that we can be doing, you know, and why and what about them makes them problematic or not? Sometimes, you know, people get caught up in thinking that sustainable packaging equals recyclability or reuse or compostability. That's not necessarily true. I mean, it's an element of it, but the thing about sustainable packaging is it's also about the functionality. And there's no point in creating a food waste issue or, you know, creating dangers or harm to medicine that's, you know, keeping people well by, you know, impacting the efficacy of the packaging itself. So, you know, part of being sustainable is about making sure there's a functionality that meets the need that packaging is created for. So happy to talk to any questions that you may have in that space this morning. If we move on to the next one, you can see that what we're talking and looking at here is really about how do we get to the 2025 targets. You know, it seems like it's a long way away, and it's actually not. It's right here. And so it's going to be here before we know it. And it's really important to understand that there is actually a very prescriptive way in which we do this work. You know, somebody referred to it as APCO having a workman-like attitude towards it. And to be frank, you need to. It's a very big piece of work. It's a very complex piece of work, and it needs to be addressed in a strategic, structured way that people can participate in and be part of that work. So initially for us, it was really around that foundation phase, which was very much around, you know, and where we are getting the business case right, if you like. And so for some of you will have read of our packaging future, which is actually the strategic framework for how we deliver on the 2025 targets out to 2025. And that sets out the thinking around collective impact. It sets out the approach, mutually reinforcing activities, all those kind of things. And then as we move along, we go, these are overlapping these kind of phases. We then have the development phase, which is very much about on the ground action. And this is where, you know, the work that Jane will talk to you about is so important, because this is where we're getting organisations and industry together and going, we have to do this work. We've got to, it's now embedded in the National Waste Policy Action Plan and in different governments, you know, this transition to the circular economy. How do we actually do that? And so that's where this is really important in terms of making sure that we're actually taking action and delivering on that and being accountable for those targets as well. And then finally, we move into this realisation phase, which is really once we're on the ground and we've got things happening and we're testing them and making sure they work, we refine them, evolve them, you know, and that's that final embedding process that you have in any kind of change activity, which is really about embedding the new way of doing business. So lots to be done over and out to 2025, but a very structured way in which we're doing it. And I would recommend, if you haven't read our packaging future, it's an incredible piece of work that took 2 years to do, had over 200 participants involved from across the entire perspective, including healthcare, of the supply chain, so government, industry, from a range of different sectors, NGOs, academics, you know, a very big and comprehensive piece of work that really coalesced the thinking in this space and gave us a good framework to work towards. So if you haven't had a chance to look at it, take a moment to read through it. It really does give you some great insight into how to get this job done. And if we move to the next slide, you can see these are the benchmark reporting from our, what would have been last December. So we've got new stuff coming out in a month or two. But this is where we were in the annual reporting against the target. So against that 100% target, we're actually doing really well. And that's at 88%. So there's this 12% of, packaging formats that are not recyclable at this stage, or compostable or reusable. And, some of the healthcare packaging does fall into that. And so there's a really concentrated piece of work that APCO is doing over the coming years around giving the technical support to work through what are the alternatives and what are the options for us in this space. And it's really at this pointy end of it, when it's a small percentage like that, it really is about being open to thinking about how to interact with the product in a different way, how to manage packaging in a different way, how to actually look at doing things. And, if we can do that from a sectorial perspective, that's actually really powerful, because it enables us to get volume and do things effectively and efficiently from a cost perspective as well. So we're doing really well on the 100%. Our lowest performing and most difficult area is actually in the plastic space, and it's really, really not, Australia is not unique in this way. It's a low performing area globally. Plastic has not been well managed at end of life. It's a great product, it's great packaging material, it does wonderful things, but it has not been managed effectively at end of life. And that is what we're really trying to change with this 70% target, and to really push and make sure that we're really considering the end of life impacts of that packaging that's just not ending up in landfill. We also have the 50% average recycled content, which we're actually tracking really well against as well. So we're at 35% of that. A lot of that is made up from, this is an average across all the material streams. So you've got involved in that, you've got paper, glass, plastic and metal. And frankly, paper is right up there in glass in terms of high performing with recycled content, less so much with plastic, which is actually very low performing. Bit of consistency there, but there you go. So there's a lot of work to be done in that space as well. And then the final target is really around the phase out. So there was an action that APCO was responsible for in the National Policy Action Plan last year, which was to provide a report on a range of products to be phased out under this target by December 2019, which we did, and which is also available for you. So if you haven't seen that, that gives you a really, not only does it give you those couple of items that are in that space now, but also a secondary list of things that are being considered for further consideration. It also gives some great definitions and a working methodology for how you can assess your packaging to work out whether it is one, single use, and then whether it is problematic and unnecessary. So that's actually a really helpful document. It's on the APCO website and available freely to you, and I'm sure we can provide copies of these to David if any of you would like to have these post this meeting as well. And then if we move to the next slide, this is where we really start to talk about how we do this. So we really do this through collective impact. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it is a strategic model that is based around and recognises that quite often wicked environmental problems or embedded social problems can't be resolved by a single organisation or a government taking some type of action. It actually requires a multi-stakeholder environment perspective and engagement. And to do that, how do you do that? And for us, it's really about this common agenda. Then you have this continuous communication, mutually reinforcing activities, and a backbone organisation that leads that, and then measuring consistent results consistently. So if you're looking at that, the common agenda really is the 2025 national packaging targets. Everybody's on page, we're all heading down the same pathway. And then the mutually reinforcing activities are things that we're doing in priority projects and working groups, things that we're working on together that actually amplifies and supports the strategic work. The backbone organisation is an organisation like APCO, who is actually there to enable and facilitate and provide the support for everybody to be able to do this work. And then finally, measuring results consistently is about the benchmarking that you saw before. It's about everybody understanding where we are and how we're progressing in this work. If we go to the next slide, you can see when we talk about these mutually reinforcing activities and working groups, this is a structure of working groups and projects that are currently operating in APCO. So you can see there is this overarching steering committee group called the CAG, which is the Collective Action Group, and they oversee these 6 other advisory groups. And then there is a range of projects that are feeding through the advisory groups into the steering committee, and that means that you have this really broad landscape of participants and stakeholders who are understanding and contributing and engaging in the work as we go forward. If we move to the next slide, you can see this is our packaging future document that I referred to, which actually supports it gives you the framework. And if you look at the next slide, you will see that these are the 3 key outcomes that are in that document. So 3 things, we can all remember 3 things. A big outcome 1 is, packaging designed for circularity. Outcome 2 is improved collection and recycling systems. And outcome 3 is expanded markets for used packaging. Sitting under each of these outcomes is 11 strategies. Under each of those 11 strategies are hundreds of mutually reinforcing activities being undertaken by both APCO, by various industry stakeholders, by governments at both a federal, state and territory level and local level. This is where you see this coalescing of action and activity that comes together and drives the work of the targets. We've included a little slide here in terms of, and the next one in terms of how we work and what's the value of working with APCO on this work. Really, the big thing for us is about driving sustainability. There is a compliance element to our work. There is a regulatory obligation for organisations over $5 million to be working actively to comply with the National Environment Protection Measure, and you can do that through working with APCO. It's an incredible organisation and an incredible community of practice that has built where you have people who would never talk to each other because they're completely different worlds, who will sit around the table and have the same end of life issue or waste problem they're trying to resolve. And it means you have this real great community that builds around that, which is a wonderful part of being part of the membership of APCO. And the reality with it also is that you get access to a whole heap of resources and activities that are there that are available to you. You are, like any business in Australia, have a right to have access to those support and services, and that's what we're here to do, help you do those things. So if we go to the next slide, you can also see that I mentioned earlier on the National Waste Policy Action Plan. So within that, we've got 10 actions, and we're working across these 4 key targets in the actual National Waste Policy Action Plan itself. So when you're working with APCO and working in the activities that we're delivering on, these are the key actions that will be driven through the National Waste Policy that you would be contributing and participating in. So the next slide lets you ask the question about how are APCO members tracking. So what we have included here is a couple of slides around, if we go to the next one, you can see, for those of you who are APCO members, you would be familiar with what this looks like. For those of you who are not, as a part of the work that you do with with APCO, you are required to report on your activity. It's a continual improvement model. So you are assessed on whether you're at level 1 to level 5, level 1 being getting started, 5 being best practice. And our job is to help organisations and industry sectors to actually get as far along that gradient as you can, and as far up what we refer to as the sustainability pyramid. So it's a model of continual improvement. What's really powerful here is currently within the membership of APCO, there's 124 members that fall into your healthcare sector. This is actually an aggregation of their general performance. So you can see what this does tell you here is where they're performing really well in some areas and less well in others, which from an organisational perspective is an incredibly powerful thing, either organisationally or sectorally, to understand, because it actually enables you to focus on the areas where you can have the most impact and effect. I mean, there's no point in doing something, putting additional effort into an area which you're already doing well, just keep doing what you're doing. What you want to do is focus on those areas that could really do with some attention that are low performing. And so strategically, this allows you to actually understand the progress of the sector, or if you are an organisation, you would also get this information each year and you could see how you are progressing. You can then compare that to the industry sector, so that you're actually able to see where you're tracking in comparison to the marketplace, which is a really powerful enabler as well. And if we look at the next slide, we can also show you where oh, no, we missed one. That's okay. So this one is actually showing you the 2020. So the first one you had there was 2019, and this is 2020. So when you get these slides, you can see how even in a 12-month period, focusing on certain areas enables the growth and the improvement of the sector. And there's quite, when you compare one slide to the other from 19 to 20, you can actually see that growth and improvement in some of those activities, like the packaging sustainability strategy, and a few other areas as well, recycled and renewable materials. So it's actually quite a useful and effective strategic tool for an organisation and a sector to have. I'll just quickly run through a couple of case studies. So if we go to the next slide and then the one after that, you can see and when you get these slides, you'll be able to read a little bit more about these. But these are some examples of packaging that is in that sustainable packaging field right now. There's great work being done by Nature's Organics, and in the next slide you can see that the work that Unilever is doing as well in terms of in both Australia and New Zealand, with their commitment to not only recycling but also putting recycled content into their product. Another great organisation we work with is Jalik, and in the next slide, and you can see that they've got some great things that they've been doing about achieving zero waste, as well as achieving sustainability outcomes. And then also, if you go to the next slide, you can see Blackmores has been a long time organisation that's worked with APCO, and they've done some really interesting work around recycling and the design of their packaging to really bring it up to par in terms of sustainability packaging. But with that, I will hand over to Jane, because I've talked for way too long. But we do have an hour, so it's okay, David. I'm sure we'll be fine. And I'll hand over to Jane on the next slide, who is going to talk about the healthcare sector a little bit.
Thank you, Brooke. And David, didn't we say we could talk till the cows came home?
Certainly did.
Good morning, everybody, and look, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm very excited to be here because, as Brooke just mentioned, I'm leading the healthcare sectoral project for APCO at the moment. So we're just really kind of getting underway with that, having had one major meeting so far, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go along. David, if you wouldn't mind moving me on to the next slide there, please. So as Brooke said, we have been working for the last couple of years to really understand the marketplace that is in operation out there around packaging. And I think one of the things that we've really understood, particularly understanding the figures, is that there are some nuanced little areas that need a bit of focus for us to achieve that 100% target. So we came to the realization after a few conversations with members and things like that, that looking at a sectoral focus was probably a very good way to do that, because it took the work that we've been doing at that higher level across the broader marketplace, and it brought it down into a more focused audience that could address specific issues within their own sector. And while we understand packaging, we don't necessarily understand the nuances of the industries. So it always helps for us to be in there and talking to the people that are at the coalface using these materials and understanding the challenges that they face. So it's proven to be quite a successful approach. And so, David, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide for me. It all started over a bottle of wine. One of our members came to us a couple of years ago in 2018 with concerns from the wine industry about some of the packaging challenges that they were facing. And on the back of that, we worked with him to establish a group of industry representatives. It became quite a large group in the initial stage, which is exactly what we're seeing with the healthcare project at the moment. And over time, it whittled down to a very small, concentrated focus group that had a good coverage across the entire packaging value chain. And it allowed us to start looking at some of those challenges in more detail. And on the back of that work, the sector collectively created their own set of sustainable packaging guidelines, which were based upon the APCO set, but targeted and focused down into those particular challenges that were relevant to the wine industry. So that group is still 2 years on, working very closely together. We sort of sit on the sidelines to help them out wherever we need to, but ultimately it's taken its own or developed its own life, and they are working very proactively together as a group representing the interests of industry and trying to improve sustainability around packaging. So that was the beginning of the process. From there, we went on and we've been working with another one of our members, which is Dairy Australia, who is an industry association, so a slightly different focus. But Dairy Australia is very proactive about driving this approach at the moment, and I'm working with their sustainability working group in that context on developing a roadmap for packaging in the dairy sector. So again, looking at those broad packaging challenges and focusing that down into a very particular dairy focus, because they have some specific challenges of their own. Another area has been the green life industry. I don't know if there are many gardeners out there listening to us this morning, but if there are, you'll know, if you're anything like me, you've got a stack of plastic pots that you've used in your garden stacked up in the back of the shed, and you don't quite know what to do with them. You know, they don't go into the household recycling bin, mostly because a lot of them are coloured black and are not detectable by the sortation systems. So we recommend that they don't go into the household recycling, and a lot of them end up in landfill because they don't have a destination. What we're doing at the moment is working with the green life industry, and that's the entire packaging value chain, to bring growers together with plastics manufacturers, together with reprocessors, together with nurseries, retail outlets, to try and create a network so that we can provide what we call an alternative destination for those materials. Keep it in its own stream. It is a very desirable material. Most of the pots and tags and stakes are made of polypropylene in this country, and interestingly, that was a decision made by industry about 30 years ago to improve their recycling profile. And now they're seeking a way to actually ensure that material is being brought back into the system. So when we talk about closed loop collaboration, they're the kind of things that we talk about where an industry is coming to, looking at its own problem, and it's creating a solution that everybody can get on board with and disseminate across the country so that we all have access to it. So that's really where it started. David, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next one for me. By contrast, the Sustainable Packaging in Healthcare group started with a toothache. It was actually, again, one of our members that came to us. We have representation from across the healthcare sector within the APCO membership. And on this occasion, it was actually a dental practitioner who was at one of our single-use plastics meetings last year in South Australia, and who came to talk to us about the amount of single-use packaging that he was seeing in his context. And probably more broadly across the healthcare sector in general. So, of course, we decided that was probably a very interesting place to look. We know that there are a lot of challenges in the space, as Brooke mentioned, around some of the regulatory requirements associated with packaging for healthcare. But we felt that there was an appetite and an audience there that were keen to discuss this in more detail. So we got ourselves organised over the summer, and we were just about ready to launch the whole thing, and COVID arrived. So it all got kind of put back a little bit, because we sort of figured that people were a bit preoccupied in the sector at that point in time. So we let it rest for a little while, and of course we went back out to the sector in April and put an expression of interest out to the whole sector, and we had the most remarkable response telling us that they wanted to go, and they wanted to go now. So in June, we had our first workshop, and we had 103 participants join us that day, and it was a starting point. I had the most remarkable feedback through our chat lines in terms of the discussion that we had during the day. There was this incredible enthusiasm in the audience with us, and we really felt that there was momentum to move it forward. So we're now continuing with that project. David, if you could move forward one slide. During that first workshop, we did a bit of surveying of the audience to understand what people saw as being the main challenges to improving their packaging sustainability in their healthcare context. So we had everybody from healthcare practitioners, doctors, nurses, anaesthetists, surgical teams, things like that in the audience. We also had businesses such as the audience that we've got today who are producing product for the healthcare sector. We had procurement people, we had government people, we had a really broad audience. So looking at that chart up on screen at the moment gives an idea that really there are probably quite a few areas there that we need to look at in terms of the challenges associated with the sector. Packaging design and recyclability, of course, is a very big one there. It's the dominating feature of the landscape on that survey. But education, collection and reprocessing capacity, cost and budget constraints, and end markets, again, all coming in a close second to one another. So I think it's fair to say that we have a clear balance of challenges to address across the sector. But I think what we can find in that is a pathway through those challenges, because many of those issues are actually quite interrelated when we look at them. So I think what we're doing at the moment from that perspective is really starting to understand how we address this. Do we do it by subsectors or subcategories within the healthcare sector? Do we do it by materials? Are we looking at facilities-based issues? Are we looking at procurement-based issues? These are the sorts of things that are starting to emerge from the work that we're doing. So David, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide. If you would click one more time for me. The challenges that we saw coming out of that workshop are quite clear, really, but as I said, a lot of them are quite interrelated, particularly around things like, design for recyclability, lining up against the lack of capacity and space in healthcare facilities to actually sort your waste correctly. So while we may have the good products going in, we may not have the capacity to actually bring it out the other end in the right way. There was also questions around the embedding of sustainable packaging at an institutional level. And I'm seeing this with some of the conversations I'm having around recovery programs that are being picked up by certain parts of healthcare facilities, but not others. So again, it's not necessarily a full approach from the healthcare facilities or healthcare organisations across the board. It's often piecemeal, and it seems to be something that's executed by enthusiastic individuals in their own workspace rather than being institutionally implemented across organisations. We also have opportunities, I think, on the other side of the equation there, looking around design particularly. We're seeing improvements in terms of access to good quality recycled materials, things like that, so we can start to look at some of the opportunities to increase recycled content in our packaging. I'm hearing amazing things about things like blister packs being separated and high yields coming from both the plastics and the metals that go into them. So I think one of the things that we're starting to see is that there is innovation. There have been challenges that have been in the way up to this point, but I really do feel like we're actually starting to see some momentum because the rest of the world is moving in this direction. So I think a lot of opportunities are beginning to present themselves, which are now becoming more applicable to the healthcare sector as we go along. So if I would ask you to move on, I'll get you to go a couple of slides there. Sorry, David, I missed the opportunities click there. One of the things I was going to say on that slide is click if you would one more time, David. There are two things that we're focusing on as a bit of quick win opportunities in the upcoming workshop next week. Many of you may be aware that there is a PVC recovery program operated by Vinyl Council and Baxter Healthcare that operates around Australia. That's one of the focuses, in that it is in very many hospitals and healthcare facilities across Australia. But as I said, it's happening in isolation. So what we're trying to work out is how we expand that across so that we can increase the volumes that are being collected in those facilities that are currently using the system and try and increase volumes to improve the viability of the recycling process at the other end of that. We also have in this workshop coming up an opportunity to look at polypropylene around the blue steri wrap that is used and is often removed from clinical environments before the threat of any kind of contamination comes into the system. Good quality material that can be quite easily recycled. And again, looking at the synergies with things like our Green Life project. Polypropylene is a very desirable material. So at the end of the day, if we can improve the volumes that we can recover from various systems and consolidate them all together, we're going to have a better opportunity to utilize that material and find those end markets and provide quality output. We're also looking at the potential for rigid PET recycling coming out of a lot of medical device manufacture that is being, again, used in clinical scenarios. Very high quality, very uncontaminated, some issues around the way that the material is put together, but we're going to look at how we can improve the recovery of that sort of material, and whether there are some things that we can do in a design context that might make it more desirable for recyclers and reprocessors to collect. So David, if you would move on to the next, I'll get you to go 2 ahead. Just that one there is lovely, thank you. So in terms of innovation, one of the things that we have been looking at very much from challenging marketplaces is the idea that when you are looking at packaging sustainability, it's not necessarily so much about thinking outside the box, it's starting with the box. If we work our way from the outside in, those things in the middle remain challenging, but we're giving ourselves a bit of space for innovation to emerge while we look at things like the cardboard boxes that we ship in to make sure that we're using as much recycled content as we possibly can in those sort of spaces. You'll notice that the targets Brooke was talking about throughout refer to national objectives in terms of things like the 50% recycled content target. It applies across all packaging. So if you can increase your recycled content in your shipping packaging, in your B2B packaging, if you can move away from single use and look into reuse models, things like that, they're the ways that we can start to look from the outside and work our way in. And as we get to those more complex things around the product that have the very high regulatory requirements associated with sanitation and hygiene and all those sorts of things, the innovation in the marketplace will hopefully be progressing alongside us, and those opportunities to improve those packaging challenges will emerge as time goes by. So David, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next one. I'm going to start with a couple of thoughts here. This is one of the ones that there are a couple of stories that I always like to go to here. One of the things that we're talking about is system change. We think at a very big systems level when we talk from the APCO perspective, and it's about understanding not just the materials that are being used, but what happens to them at the end of the process and how we keep them in that circular economy for as long as possible. And sometimes that's actually a system change. It may be that you need to think about the entire system that your product operates in and make a shift away from what you're doing or in a different direction from where you are. Kodak's a great example of that. There was a step in their product repertoire many years ago that looked like they were going down the digital path. We all thought, wow, this is great, new technology. They put digital screens on the back of their cameras. And then David, if you wouldn't mind just giving me one more click there. The only thing that they missed was they forgot to actually move the production of the images into a digital space and kept printing onto film. And of course, as we've seen over the years, film has just gone by the wayside, and they kind of got left behind where they had tried to retrofit something new onto an old system. And it didn't quite work. It didn't have the legs that the guys that were going full digital were actually delivering. And as a result, it's kind of petered out. And how often do you see Kodak around these days? Not terribly often. There's another example, David, if you give me one more click, there's another example there. Blockbuster was another. Rather than looking at what all those companies like Netflix and streaming businesses were doing, they decided to set up imprinting machines in their stores. So you come in, you select your movie, you get it onto your USB stick or onto your CD and take it home, and then you watch it and then you dispose of it however you might need to, rather than actually looking at the next step, which was to go into a streaming environment. And as a result, I think 2 or 3 months ago, we saw the very last Blockbuster store in the US close its doors permanently. So again, trying to retrofit something new onto old systems. We have to try and think away from that sort of space and be a bit more creative and think about these things from that holistic level to understand whether or not it is an entire system change that we need to implement. David, if you'd pop on for one more slide. I started doing a little bit of, well, I regularly do research around packaging innovation just to see what's going on out there. And I have to say the healthcare space is somewhere that there hasn't been a lot of movement. There is clear enthusiasm. I was looking at the Health Pack conference that went on in the States earlier in the year to see whether there was any creativity in there. Ultimately, there is a lot of enthusiasm to move down this path, but seemingly quite a few barriers in the way, and it's not moving quite as fast as perhaps people would like. So I think that's one of the things that there are some areas there that we really need to look at in terms of how we create this innovation that we need to move the packaging in this space forward. And as I said, holistic thought is a very big part of this. David, if you wouldn't mind moving forward. There are a couple of things that I did think about, have seen conversations around. Things like leveraging existing recovery programs is a great opportunity. You know, we're seeing things like container deposit schemes being set up. We're looking at the product stewardship model for plant packaging. Alternative destinations and existing recovery programs offer opportunities that we could look at to consider. So for example, where you've got your return on wanted medicines program, why can't we tack on something that collects the plastic bottles that the medicines come in as well, and see if we can return those into the system. And up on the right hand side there, you can see an example of how that works when you can get your hands on good quality clean stream recyclate. Nature's Way, I believe the brand there is in the US. I think we have them here in Australia too, are putting product into the marketplace in containers that contain 97% post-consumer recycled content. So there are ways of doing this, and we need to challenge some of those naysayers that suggest that perhaps this isn't something that we can do in the healthcare sector, because it's happening, but it needs to be more widespread. The little example on the bottom there was an example of some innovation that perhaps wasn't quite so clever. The idea that we've got a nice little single served hand sanitizer unit there, pinchable, clean, sanitary. The issue there is that that piece of plastic would never make it through a material recovery facility and would potentially end up in landfill. So while the design is clever and creative, again, it's been thought of at the beginning of the chain rather than at the end, and it's not taking that holistic approach to the design and innovation. So some warnings there just to keep thinking about. David, if you wouldn't mind moving one more ahead. The other thing that we're hearing a lot about in this space is compostable plastic packaging, compostable packaging generally. There are some warnings there that we would caution you to have a look at. There are 4 very different quadrants there on the left-hand side, identifying the complexities of bioplastics and biodegradability. Some plastics are biodegradable, but they're not. Some plastics are bioplastics, but they're not biodegradable. Some plastics are normal plastics and they are biodegradable. Some are compostable. There's a whole world of confusion in the language that sits around this space. We earlier this year put out a document that gives good guidance in where compostable packaging is an appropriate use. And there is a set of decision trees in the back of that document, which will ask you a number of questions in terms of the application of compostable packaging, and will give you a reading as to whether or not that is a feasible option in this country at the moment. It is calibrated to Australia's capabilities right now as to whether or not we can process compostable packaging. And unless you are working predominantly in an application where you are recovering food waste and are improving outcomes in that context, the general recommendation at this point in time is perhaps not to go down that pathway just yet. It's really not, we're not in a place where we're actually able to process a lot of those materials. One of the things that we're seeing at the moment, though, across Australia is an increasing interest in food and organic collection at the household level. As we start to see that emerge right across the country, the capacity for processing compost will be much greater, and as a result, we might see more opportunities for those applications of compostable in packaging scenarios. So just a word of warning there. I would very much suggest that you have a look at that document and educate yourself on some of the challenges that we face in that space. So David, if you'd like to pop on to the next one. A couple of next steps. We have a meeting next week. I will share with David the registration link for that workshop if you would be interested in joining us. As I mentioned earlier, we've got 3 areas that we're focusing on this time round. But this is, again, just the beginning. Our next steps will be looking at how we break down the sector into more manageable chunks and understand a little bit more about the material flows through those various subcategories, I guess, within the sector, and how we start to address that. The second step is to start thinking about your packaging sustainability strategy if you haven't already, and the sustainable packaging guidelines up on the APCO website are a great place to start. And be informed. I can see a lot of questions coming up in the screen here, and we're going to take great pleasure in answering those in a moment. But it is a very good step to make sure that you understand this space very, very well before you make your decisions. And that's what APCO is here to help you with. So join us at the workshop, get involved in what you can participate in the APCO space, have a look at our resources. And I'll pass back to Brooke, because I'm sure she's got some other words of wisdom at the end of that to bring that conversation to a close.
Thank you, Jane. David, if you want to go to the last slide, everyone can see there are contact details for APCO. Please reach out if you are not a member of APCO and it's something you want to be involved with. We're happy to talk to you, and as we've mentioned throughout the presentation, Jane and I will provide various bits of information that we've mentioned here to David and the team to pass along to those of you who may be interested to know more. But I see you've got some questions, David.
We do have questions. Thank you so much, Jane and Brooke. And I probably should have mentioned this at the start of the meeting. If you do have questions, by all means, send them through to the Q&A. Both Brooke and Jane have kindly agreed to make the presentation slides available at the end of today's talk, so I'll share them with you. And they've also agreed to make the video available. So we'll go with the first question. For the organisations that are progressing well against the targets, what do you think they're doing better internally versus other organisations that are struggling a bit? Better processes, better team approach? What would you say is the defining aspect there?
I think when we go back and you look at those slides which show the performance in 2019 to 2020, what organisations who are doing well get is that this is not about them as an individual organisation, it's about them within the context of the system. And the discussion that Jane and the point that she made around embracing change and actually recognising that you are part of a solution, but only a part of it, you're wholly responsible for it, means that it actually does take some of the pressure off you. You realise that you have a role to play, you have an obligation and a job to do here, but you're not going to achieve that whole thing by yourself. So once you start to shift to that systems thinking and understanding that this is a collective problem that you need to be part of to resolve, it then opens the organisation's way of thinking and engaging, really having partaking in that structured approach. And I think that's really powerful when you look at that slide that's got all of that spider graph on it that's got 13 criteria there. An organisation is going to work through each one of those criteria. It's a very prescriptive way of actually breaking down, if you like, chunking down what is sometimes a really big, just way big problem, and chunking it down into these 13 areas and going, okay, well, this year I'm going to get this bit right, and I'm going to do that bit with that bit, and you actually really start to be able to chunk it down into manageable sizes that you can work through, and that's really important. So I think from an organisation, it's important to appreciate and own that this is a systems problem, embrace that there's change that has to happen. We quite often see this really kind of hits the tipping point and becomes really progressive when you have that top-down approach as well. Quite often you'll see sustainability teams within an organisation push out to the broader organisation, really get people engaged in the work and wanting to have an impact, and then you'll see them push that up, and then you get that top-down support as well. And so you've got these pressure coming together and everybody on the same page, and it's that common agenda the national packaging targets really helps drive, that makes organisations work effectively in this space.
Yeah, sure. In your view, what's the biggest obstacle today for organisations to achieve the 2025 targets?
Well, I think, there are obviously obstacles and barriers and challenges, etc. And, Jane went through some of those today. And I think if you go back and you look at those workshop findings from the first workshop we did, especially in the healthcare sector, there are a whole lot of things in there around, and some of the major things there were around design and recyclability and education. But I mean, if you look at design and recyclability, it's really about engaging in the conversation. It's where working groups like the one that Jane's hosting next week are so important, because that's where you actually get to get some of that thinking out and going, hang on, wait a second, I'm the guy doing this job. I'm the woman who's at the coalface here. I know and I understand what the implication of making that change is, and that's not going to work. And that's fine to have that understanding. That's the kind of thing that we need to have discussions about, because if it's not going to work in that context, the reality is we have to make it work. So how do you make it work? And the thinking that's really important. This is where collective impact is really essential. It's about saying that we may not within our own organisation have everything we need to resolve this, but if we put this bit of our information with these other people and we work on this together, and then we work with an organisation like APCO who can help us deliver on this, you then have the capability to do something really powerful. And that's where those those challenges become opportunities. You know, every challenge is an opportunity, and that's the way you have to look at it. It's not something that's impossible to do. It's just something that we may not be able to do very well today, or we may not be able to do it all today. It doesn't mean that we can't change that and there can't be a different future for us, because we need to have a different future. You know, when you talk about this work, we're talking about packaging, but you are talking about the community in which you live in. You are talking about your oceans, your beaches, your parks, your kids, and what their lifestyle and their environment is like as they grow and become older, you know, and as your grandkids do, you know, and you've got to think about that in this context of, we're just talking about packaging, but these have real tangible impact. So, you know, when you're thinking about this kind of space, that's where you really need to think about what is the impact of this and what's the role of an organisation and sector in actually achieving a really significant change.
Yeah.
I also have to add, I think having all the people around the table gives a transparency, I guess, across the whole sector. You know, when somebody's talking about putting a product into the market and they're talking about packaging design and the technical recyclability of it is clear in their head, you have a waste handler or a reprocessor on the other side of the table talking about the fact that they can't do anything with that material. There's no end market for it, and there's no reason for them to actually collect it. Then the designer suddenly starts to think, oh, hang on, I need to change the way I'm thinking. And it's all about having that kind of conversation where everybody participates in terms of understanding each person's role in the value chain and the challenges that they face, and how collectively you can find a way to actually address those. And that's, from my perspective, this is the power of the groups that I sort of lead, because they are all sitting around a table going, we've got a problem, we need to fix it. What do we do? So yeah, it really does drive that very open dialogue, I think.
Yeah, and Jane makes a really good point, because it's that transparency, and that's the beauty of, you know, being a co-regulatory body like APCO, is we have no commercial interest in any particular packaging format, in any particular material, or any particular manufacturer or organisation. Our job is actually that environmental objective, and being able to have that independent view of, we're actually shooting for a larger, higher order objective here, means we can have all those people sitting around the table, and you'll get exposed to information and understanding that you just weren't aware of. You just didn't know, because, you know, you're not a packaging manufacturer, you're not a waste or recycling company, you're people who work in healthcare, and so you're really great at that. But these other people have elements of the story that you need to understand to be able to do what you have to do.
And it's interesting, I saw one of the questions early was talking about, or asking why are plastics generally not recycled if there are problems with it. You know, it's those little things like, you know, the way things are designed. If it's got complex materials that mean that they can't be separated out in such a way that there is a sufficient yield for it to be viable for a business to reprocess that material. Those are the sorts of things. Tiny little, you know, tamper evident seals and things like that on bottles that can pull away and end up being lost in the system. They don't go through a MRF because they're too tiny. They fall through all the conveyor belts and things. So the likely destination for them is landfill. So there's a very large proportion of stuff that goes through the system that just has those little nuanced challenges that, you know, we saw Nestle did a complete rework of one of their packaging formats a while ago with their Almond's lollies to remove that tamper evident seal, or not remove it, it's still there, but it doesn't come away from the packaging. So when the packaging goes through the MRF, it's still there and it's kept with the package, and it will end up in a reprocessor's hands. So it's little things like that you know, again, that sort of conversation, if you as a designer don't know that because you've never spoken to a MRF operator, how do you know? So yeah, it just provides that conduit conversation. It's good.
I'm not sure this is outside of your purview, but I noticed with Nature's Own, it was 97% post-consumer recycled content. Is there a big cost difference between that sort of packaging and normal packaging? Is there a cost issue here as well as for companies?
Yeah, there actually can be, and I mean, this is it's the issue that we have right now, especially with recycled content. It is an evolving space, and so and especially with really low oil prices, you obviously therefore have equals low virgin plastic material prices, which makes it harder for recycled content to be competitive. But here's the thing, and why that 50% recycled content target is really important, because we're trying to push the value of those materials up and to give them a home. And to do that, we need more people doing it. And, you know, if you look across the world and you look at places like Europe, where they're heavily regulated and mandated systems, where industry is actually obligated to do this in a different way to what we do it in Australia, you can see we're trying to achieve the same thing here, but we're giving, what government is giving industry in Australia is the opportunity to do that without a big, essentially a very costly bureaucratic and regulatory system over the top of that. And that's why it's really important as an industry to be engaged and to take the initiative and show leadership and do this in the space, because there is a global trend towards especially with the plastic space. You know, we're just launched the development phase of the ANZPAC Plastics Pact here in Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, which kicks off on the 1st of January next year. And that work will even give even more visibility to the plastic space and the need to be more prescriptive in this recycled content space. And it's like any marketplace, the more, you know, it's the classic supply and demand. So the more people that are wanting or using recycled content, the more reasonable the cost will become, the more people, the more of it will be produced. It's simple economics, you know. And at the first part, it's always more difficult than as it evolves and becomes stronger and more commonplace.
It's probably worth mentioning, yes, there's two questions here. APCO workshop, CHP Australia will be in attendance. We will be attending that. And there was also a question about our sustainability working group. So I'll send out some more information following the meeting on that. One of the other questions we had was, how does Australia compare to other countries in terms of establishing targets and making progress towards them? As a multinational, you know, what sort of challenges do they have?
You know what, I think it's such a great question. I'm glad that somebody asked it, because it's so terrible here in Australia. I think we still suffer a little colonialism where we think that, you know, everybody does it better than us. Here's the reality. You know, especially if you're talking about plastic, it is a global problem. There is nobody who's out there who is like 10 years in front of anybody else. We are all very much at the same place. You know, really the two leading geographies in the world for dealing with the plastics problem are the UK and Australia. You know, and we're doing it best. Even in Europe, where it's a heavy regulatory and mandatory system, when you get on the ground over there, there is a very big gap between the rhetoric and the action, and you know, and which is quite startling. And you know, it's the rhetoric is very active, but there is a very big gap between what one says they're doing and what's actually happening. Whereas here in Australia, because the work that we're doing is coming from a co-design and a co-regulatory space, what industry is doing is actually action orientated and really valuable, and it's got some, and has business value in it as well. And that's a huge difference. And I mean, even when you look at something like you know, specific activities, and like labelling is a great example, the Australasian Recycling Label, the ARL. It's world leading. Like the platform that we use for that, the PrEP, you know, the Packaging Recyclability Evaluation Portal, that's an online tool that was developed by an Australian innovator, an entrepreneur, that we use here in Australia and New Zealand now. It's also gone to the UK, it's in Singapore, you know, and gosh knows where else it will pop up. But, you know, that's an Australian invention, you know, and quite often we tend to think that everybody's just doing it better than us, and we buy into this kind of rhetoric that says that, you know, everything's got to happen in a certain way, and the Europeans are doing it better and the Americans are doing it better. Well, the reality is it's just not true. You know, we've got a 2-year-old labelling program that has more members in it than two programs, the other two leading programs in the world that have been established for more than 10 years. So we've achieved in 2 years what's taken them, they haven't even achieved in 10 years. You know, so it's just, we really, and an industry tends to think that, you know, because we're in this bottom part of the world, that everybody's doing it better. And the reality is, God, we're the creator of Google Maps, the black box, the bloody lawnmower, for goodness sake. We've got this incredibly innovative industry and country here in Australia, and great thinkers, and you know, really action orientated, and there is absolutely no reason. And one of the things I find really disappointing is when people say, oh, we just can't do this. Like, seriously, are you really saying that, is anyone really going to say that a country like this can't manage its own packaging waste successfully in a circular economy? Of course we can. We just need to work through how to get there.
Yeah. Excellent. That's a really positive message to leave it on as well. And I thank you both, Brooke and Jane, for your time today. Wonderful hearing from both of you. If you guys aren't members of APCO already, I strongly encourage you to join. If you want to join our working group, our sustainability working group, I would encourage you to join it, and I'll send some information out following the meeting. I'll also send some information about the slides. I'll send some slides, and I'll also send the video as well. So thank you, Jane and Brooke. And yep, and we look for. Sorry, go.
Say if you're happy for me to share the link to the sectoral project workshop next week,
yes,
I will share that with you for anybody that would be interested to join us.
Yep, that'd be great. That'd be great. So thank you for coming today, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.